Welcome back, everyone. This is Dan Liebenson, and I'm here with B'nai Lappi for another episode of the Oral Talmud. Hey, B'nai.
Hey Dan, how you doing?
I'm doing good. And
Good.
we have a pretty exciting announcement for folks, which is that probably next week, but if not next week, then the week after, we are going to start releasing this show as a podcast. And it's also going to be video, so we're going to continue doing what we're doing now. So if you've been watching along on video, you're welcome to keep coming back on Thursdays at 12 noon Eastern time, 9 a.m. Pacific, and all the other times in between. But if you're somebody who has just found this, or you have friends who don't want to watch things, they'd rather listen to things, they're going to be able to download this as a podcast soon. And what we're going to do is we're going to release our first episode plus the two most recent episodes that we did about protest on day one, whenever day one is exactly. And then we'll start releasing episodes more or less in the order that they were recorded. We might change it up a little bit to put things next to each other that belong more next to each other, but more or less it's going to be in that order. So the video is going to be probably a couple of months ahead of the audio. And so folks who are watching on video can feel proud that they know what's coming. But we're really excited about that. And so please start spreading the word to people that you think would be interested. And we'll keep you posted about when that's going to happen. So that's exciting.
It is.
Yeah. And another exciting thing today, actually, now that I'm conscious that we're releasing this as a podcast and I know these first few seconds are going to get edited out, I feel like I need to start in a place where I'm going to find it comfortable to cut it so that it can comfortably be where the podcast starts. So I'm just going to say it, and also I'm just going to say it. So today we are going to look at a text that is the first text that we're covering on this show that's not structured as a story, as what you can call agadah, or something that's basically structured in the form of a story, but rather something that's structured as what's called halacha, really a legal text, or something that's structured as more or less an analytical, rule-oriented text that's trying to get at, well, what are we supposed to do in more direct terms? I think that one thing, B'nai, I would just ask you to reflect a little bit about as you set it up also is is there really a difference? Meaning are the story texts really just kind of legal texts in a different form and vice versa? Or do you see a really profound difference between those?
Well, it used to be seen as a completely different kind of literature. That is, the story stuff was seen as not that important and extraneous and extra, and the stuff that you sort of quote unquote teach women, that's okay if they learn it because it's not all that important. Big sticky on that whole thing. And the legal stuff, that's really the important stuff. And with Robert Cover, Alav Hashalom, he started saying, maybe 25 or so years ago, that wait a minute, pardon me?
I think it was a lot longer, sadly.
Was it a lot longer? Okay, so maybe that's when I read his piece, which is in the Harvard Law Review, called Nomos and Narrative. And I think he was the first person to really say, hey, you've all missed the fact that the story stuff and the legal stuff are actually intertwined in a very important way. And Barry Wentheimer, who we had on our show, also fleshes this out in his work. And that is, the new idea is that the quote unquote stories actually problematize, complexify, and challenge the legal material to essentially say, hey, we have this nice, clear statement of law or debate about law, but you know what? It's actually more complex. My lived life experience tells me, and here's a story from our experience that makes that simple statement of law too simple. And we need to destabilize it, and we need to complexify it. And as a queer person whose lived life experience really reveals the inadequacy of simple understandings of how the world should be, including law, this feels very, very resonant and true for me. And I think it's if you read it as a queer person or through the lens of knowing what the ways that your life experience challenge accepted ideas, you go, oh, wow, I see what this story is doing.
Mm.
So they are intertwined, I think.
Yeah, I think that's something we should return to again and again, that question, because for sure, for sure, it's what you're saying. And I wonder even more whether the story stuff is actually the most important legal
Mhm.
stuff, and the tragedy of putting it in the realm of, what, of course, I would say, which should be in an honored position of things that are for women, but what they meant was that it was a dishonored position, that it's just for women. That stuff, it's like they threw out effectively the most important stuff, and that comes from all kinds of complex reasons, but that if you think about it sort of evolutionarily, if you think about humans as basically animals, that we're hardwired to learn through storytelling. I've actually been increasingly frustrated as a post Enlightenment person at how much people are not hardwired to learn through factual reason and analysis. Actually, there was something just the other day where Dr. Fauci, who's the head of our response to the coronavirus, was kind of lamenting in a certain way that they're just these people out there who, like, they're just oriented not to listen to science, whoever you're talking about. But I actually think that that's not unusual, meaning it's actually hard for people as creatures. It's hard for them, hard for us to take in ideas that are merely put out there as ideas. And it's actually extremely easy to take in ideas in the form of a story or maybe other types of so say technologies that pass along wisdom, like proverbs or songs or all these kind of technologies. And in some ways, like, that analytical stuff is the least easy to take in. And so it's either the case that the rabbis understood that and therefore they put the more important stuff in the form of stories, or they didn't understand it, and tragically a lot of their stuff was never really all that effective because they failed to put it in the form of stories.
I think they did understand it, which is why there's this constant back and forth between argumentation about law and stories which inform, push, undermine, destabilize, complexify that law. And I think it was in part the effort, the misunderstanding of the quote unquote story, which led to the de-emphasis and the sort of mental sifting out of those narratives, which left a document that people have, partly as a result, misread as a code, and it's left the Talmud victim of kind of a misunderstanding,
Mm,
because it's been read largely without the realization of the importance of all of the narratives, and therefore becomes code, and that's never what it was intended to be.
mm.
Um,
All right. Well, so tell us a little bit about the setup for this particular text.
okay, so this is the first passage that we're discussing on this show that is not in the category of quote unquote story or agada, but it's a legal passage, and it's in the Tractate of Sanhedrin, which deals generally with courts, judicial processes. The Sanhedrin is the big court and court system. So this tractate is dealing with the various levels of courts, evidentiary procedures, requirements for judges, punishments meted out by courts. So that's our general court. I'm getting am I okay?
You're okay.
Okay, so that's the general context and the tractate that we're in. So I just want to set this up by describing just the tiniest bit about the court system. So this is Jewish Judicial System 101. So there are three kinds of courts. There is a Beit Din, that's a court of three. there is a Sanhedrin, a lower Sanhedrin, which is a court of 23, and a high Sanhedrin, or a great Sanhedrin, which is a court of 71. And each of these courts deals with a different kind of case. So unlike our legal system that divides up over civil and criminal, the Jewish legal system divides up over what kind of punishment would be meted out if a person were guilty. So is it a monetary case or is it a capital case? So if it's a monetary case, meaning a case which the punishment for a guilty party would be a fine, that's adjudicated by a court of 3, that's a Sanhedrin. If we have a capital case, a case for which a defendant, if found guilty, would be executed, that's dealt with by a court of 23. And P.S., the rabbis found capital punishment, which was described and called for in Torah, they found it very distasteful, and it said that a Sanhedrin that found someone guilty of a capital crime in 7 years, and others say in 70 years, was a kind of bloody court. So they did everything they could to make that not happen. And finally, the court of 71, the Great Sanhedrin, dealt with cases like declarations of war, setting the calendar, declaring a false prophet, appointing judges to the court of 23, and so on. Okay, so that's a little bit about the legal system, and our text deals with the court of 23, a Sanhedrin that is adjudicating capital cases and deciding life and death for the defendant. Okay, so here we go.
Okay, so let's start.
I think I'll throw one more thing in, which is, even though I feel like saying, I love this text, this is my favorite text, every single time we learn something, this is actually my favorite text. If there's only one text that I could ever teach, right? If you're going to give me 1 hour and you're going to say, hey, Benny, tell me something about the Talmud, give me an example, this is the text I always choose, this one.
We should have built the episode that way. We should have marketed. That would be good marketing. Tell me.
Sorry.
Okay. So let's start. So the way that the way the text starts is as follows. Rav Kahana says, in a Sanhedrin, and as you say, a Sanhedrin of 23,
right,
where all judges saw fit to convict the defendant, they acquit him. So if there's a majority, if there's a unanimous verdict, it's an acquittal.
Right.
We should start. I think we have to start there.
Right. So the text opens up with a kind of procedural statement. It says, if there is a unanimous verdict in a capital case, every one of the 23 judges votes guilty, 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 straight down the line to convict. What do we do to the defendant? We set him free.
Right.
So very counter
of the American legal system.
Exactly the opposite, right? In the American legal system, obviously you could talk more to this than I can. The only time we feel comfortable that we can execute someone in a capital case is when there is a unanimous vote for guilty, right?
Right.
Okay.
For a criminal case, I mean, for civil cases, it's different, or it could be different, but in criminal cases, and for sure in a death penalty case, it has to be unanimous. That's obvious, right? I mean,
right, exactly. And in Jewish law, if you get 23 Jews to agree on something, you know something is wrong.
Right.
Right? So it's dafka, the unanimity of the verdict, which is what calls the verdict into suspicion. And if this is the case that everyone agrees, we immediately set the defendant free. Now, after having said that, this is Rav Kahana who puts this forward. Rav Kahana is in the first generation of what we call Amoraim, which is the second stage of rabbis. This is early 3rd century. the Gemara or the editor now puts in the question, what? Wait a minute. Why would we do that? Why would we let the defendant go free if every single one of the 23 judges agrees that he's guilty? Okay. And here comes the answer.
So the Gemara asks, what is the reasoning for this rule? The reasoning is, since it is learned as a tradition that the suspension of the trial overnight is necessary to create the possibility of an acquittal, and those judges saw fit to convict him, and as those judges all saw fit to convict them, they will not see any further possibility to acquit him. So can you explain that?
Yeah, okay. So the editor puts in the question, what is the reason that you would acquit and set free this defendant if all 23 judges, for sure a majority, found him guilty? And the editor goes on to say, wait a minute, how come we're not going to follow the procedure that we know we're supposed to follow anytime a majority rules for conviction? And we know that the standard rule is if there's any majority, they do what's called a halanat din, which is basically means a sleep on it, a sleepover judgment. And that means that you have to hold over till the next day the declaration of the verdict, and all the judges have to stay up all night, not eat or drink, and deliberate again on their guilty verdict in the hopes that after the overnight deliberation, they would take a revote and the revote would show innocent. In other words, there would not be a majority for guilt and the defendant would be exonerated. And the rule is also that those judges who had ruled innocent on the first day cannot change their vote to guilty on the revote the next day. But those who had voted guilty could change their vote. So they stay up all night re-arguing the case in the hopes that they will revote the next day and find the defendant innocent. So the editor, the Gemara, is asking, wait a minute, how come in this case we have a majority, we're not doing this sleepover process? And the answer is, and the original is actually much more beautiful than this translation. The original says, these guys already are not going to see him. They don't see him. In other words, there would be no use in doing a sleepover process because we can tell by the mere fact that they've all agreed to guilty that not a single one could have said, wait a minute, I'm not sure, or I think he's innocent, that they're not truly seeing this person. They're looking at someone who looks screamingly guilty, right? If we're going to talk about black, white, black being guilty, they look absolutely guilty. I mean, it's probably not a great metaphor, but they look at someone who on this person's appearance or at the first consideration of the evidence, there's certainty. And it's the certainty which is evidence that the defendant hasn't been truly seen. And if these guys aren't going to truly see this defendant, they know that there's no hope in the redeliberation. So we should sit with that for a minute.
I mean, I think this is a technical point, but I think that maybe one of the differences in the legal system described here versus the American or the Anglo-American legal system is that in the Anglo-American legal system, there's an understanding, an expectation that the charged party would have a lawyer, and that it's the lawyer's job to provide the vigorous defense. And that comes into American legal ethics that Alan Dershowitz has written about this and many, many others, right? That the idea that there's almost a obligation within the Anglo-American legal system that your defense counsel provides the most vigorous possible defense, even if it comes right up to in fact, I think Alan Dershowitz would say that it must come right up to the ethical line. but not cross it, but that it must come all the way up to the ethical line, because if not, then the defense attorney hasn't really done what is necessary to be done in order to create a fair trial, which is to give the person the best possible defense. And maybe if you have that level of defense, you can give the jury, in this case, the jury, a different, which I think of the Sanhedrin is analogous to the jury. It has a different role in that, since somebody else has played the role of the defense attorney, then maybe you could say that unanimity is not as bad, let's say. But maybe not. I think what's interesting here, if I'm understanding you correctly, is that the notion that there is unanimity, or the fact of unanimity, suggests that there's no point in having this overnight reconsideration, because there's nobody really around to give a real defense. There's nobody, it's all becomes a theoretical exercise.
Yeah, and
I'll
I
play devil's advocate, but that's different from, I really
yeah,
believe that this person shouldn't be convicted.
yeah, there's something in the unanimity which implies that true investigation and evaluation hasn't been done. And that, it's as if a mistrial is being called because the judges have been seen as inadequate, and no amount of further process is going to make them more adequate.
Mm-hmm.
They are somehow prejudiced to the actual truth of this defendant, or there's something going on which is not going to be solved by reconsideration.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And that launches them into the question of, okay, so who these people are who are sitting on the Sanhedrin is really important. Because
Before we get to that, though, can I one thing that idea makes me think about is political orthodoxies, and the idea that I know that a lot of let's say moderate liberals these days, I see them on Facebook complaining about the expectation that they should be swept into a particular political movement that they might feel is too radical for them. And as opposed to an idea that it would be okay to have a debate. Here I'm talking about progressive to radical circles. I'm not talking about with conservatives or whatever on the right, but I'm saying, like, I'm hearing this within the left, that there's concern that there's an expectation that if you don't sort of fully endorse the more radical perspectives, that you should just stay quiet. And I'm not sure that that's only a perception from those who are more like less left of center. That I think that might actually be what the folks who are much farther to the left actually would prefer. And I guess I wonder whether, we don't have to necessarily talk about it, but I think it's interesting to ponder whether there's some musar here, some lessons for us across the political spectrum, to say that we shouldn't even want that kind of complete endorsement of even a political view that we strongly believe in. Like, we should want debate in society as much as we want the outcome that we're trying to achieve. I think it's complex, and it's not so clear. It depends on the situation, depends how far gone society is. But I do feel like that's what hit me as I was listening to you talk. I was like, well, maybe there is actually something to say here about our political culture, and not only death penalty cases.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's very difficult to express not even so much disagreement, but desire to interrogate assumptions or aspects of a political stance which you may agree with or you may be largely with, because there's the perception that it is going to undermine the case, or that it reveals your own moral impurity somehow, that you're not, I think you're right.
And I like the idea, though. Like, I think it would be interesting. What would it mean to truly embrace this idea that if everybody is with us, we got to
Yeah,
stop? Right? If
right.
everybody's with us, we better slow this thing down because something is wrong here. Let's make sure that we're actually creating room for dissent.
Yeah,
That resonates with me.
yeah, absolutely. On the other side, what's coming up for me at this particular moment is, the whole question about defunding the police
Hmm.
and the efforts that have been made to reform and train and, put restrictions, and they haven't worked, and they haven't worked, and they haven't worked.
Right.
And the, you know, maybe this is also suggesting the people involved are the police may be so deeply shaped by the racist assumptions of our culture that they have to be dismissed. In other words,
Right. Right.
you know, as the text says, they already can't see this person. They can't see the defendant. There's
Right.
no way they're going to be able to see the people on the street and treat them fairly. So there's something that
Oh,
resonates.
yeah, I absolutely think that's what this is saying. And
Hmm.
it's where I've been trying to explain to people that what does defund the police mean? I think fundamentally it means that reform is not possible. It
Right.
doesn't mean there shouldn't be people out there protecting the peace. It should mean that let's start a new organization. We can call them the Schmalice, like we're just talking about rabbis and schmabbis, like there would be the Schmalice. They would do a lot of the same things that the police were doing before, but it would be a new beginning, and we would structure it with certain assumptions and certain practices that were foundational and that could not be abrogated. And those things, for historical reasons and racist reasons, those things were there. This is what structural racism means, right? Those things were there from the beginning. They actually can't be undone. So you start over. It's not the worst thing in the world to start over, and it doesn't mean that, if all the police officers are dismissed because you've defunded doesn't mean they can't be hired as a schmaliceman. I mean, it could happen. They may or may not, but it doesn't mean that everybody all of a sudden right, but that's sort of fundamentally what it means. And I think that the idea that it's the unanimity that's the problem. It's the idea that there's an expectation that this is how the police have to behave. That ipso facto is a problem. If people are
Right.
talking that way, that's got to be stopped.
Right. And for me, the equivalent of the unanimity is the understanding, the realization that when you live in a racist society, you are going to hold racist views and not unknowingly act in racist ways.
Right.
Unless you build a system with anti-racist and self-aware, a new worldview. And this court is being understood to be structurally racist. In other words, systemically growing out of a problematic set of assumptions. And I think that's what the text is implying when it says these guys cannot possibly see this defendant.
Yes.
They have to, it's not so much that the defendant is being dismissed. It's really the 23 judges who are being deemed inadequate.
Right. And I mean, it's interesting, like, just to try to follow the particular case of a criminal case, a capital offense, right? You would, let's say, right, when do you achieve unanimity? I mean, you can achieve unanimity for all kinds of terrible reasons, like racism, but you can also achieve unanimity because, like, there was a video and it was a smoking gun video, literally, right? And you actually saw it, right? And so, like, how could there not be unanimity? But I think there's a suggestion that it's the fact of unanimity, even in the case. I mean, I guess I want to play this out. I want to think about it, because there's this, like, you often do in law or in Talmud, is take the really hard case. Like, it's a serial killer. It's a serial killer where there was a video, right? And it's like, how could there not be unanimity? Well, they're suggested there should be still some way to say that not quite, like maybe he had a hard childhood. I don't know what the
the Talmud actually deals with that.
Okay.
I think the case that illustrates what you're talking about is that the Talmud says in Jewish law requires a court of 23 who themselves have witnessed the murder in front of their eyes. Right? The murder happens in front of the 23. You know what happens?
I'm assuming he's not guilty.
Those 23 have to recuse themselves from the court, and a different 23 have to judge the case. I'm not sure what to do with that. In other words, there's a case where there's a video, essentially.
Right.
So
you would get the other 23, and if all 23 is still convicted, then you would be not guilty.
Absolutely.
I mean, it raises the question for me, like, what is it that, and I asked this question not necessarily with the assumption that this must be the best possible rule, but on the sense that we're giving it the credit of that there's real wisdom here. What is the wisdom? What is it trying to say to us that even in the most egregious case of criminal wrongdoing, that there should not only should we have some degree of compassion, some degree of listening for what's called in American law mitigating circumstances, but that we should have so much of that compassion that at least one person is so filled with it that they cannot even cross the line to say conviction, even if there's a video, right? So that's a lot. That's really a lot of compassion, empathy, whatever we want to call it.
And I think it's healthy doubt and skepticism. Skepticism of the law,
right,
which is requiring me to execute this person, as well as skepticism. And I think that's where this text goes. It's going to be going to the possibility that what was going on for the judges, for Rav Kahana, in saying that the defendant should be exonerated, is not only an indictment of these 23, but of the law these 23 are bound to uphold, which is that the defendant should be executed and the capital. Okay, so
is this only for capital cases, by the way? I mean, it says in the translation that it is, but
yes, I think as far as I know.
That's interesting. I mean, because there certainly are different laws for capital cases in American law as well. There's and it still requires unanimity, but there's the law treats it in a different way. So it's interesting. It's interesting if this is only for capital cases, because part of me thinks like this should be for every criminal case. If the wisdom is right for capital cases, it should be true for other criminal cases, because there are a lot of other ways in which people are oppressed by the law, short of being executed, as we from our society. And it would be interesting to imagine a world in which, again, we had that much compassion and that much understanding of the root causes, et cetera, that we say, there's got to be at least one person who's so moved by that they would refuse to convict. Only then can we be sure that at least there was a reasonable conversation among the judges.
Yeah, and I think it has to do with the necessity to look at something or someone and understand that there's something beyond what you can perceive. And it's not only compassion, but it's the recognition that what is apparent is not complete, what is obvious is not necessarily so, that your perception may be inaccurate, right? It's a kind of humility and recognition that we really shouldn't be so sure.
Yeah.
And if there's not a single person in this court of 23 that has that ability to say, hey, we shouldn't be so sure, this is an invalid procedure. It's a mistrial.
Yeah. It's interesting because I actually was once the lone holdout juror that caused a mistrial. in a case. It was actually a drunk driving case. I was I'm a lawyer, and what I took away from that was that as a defense lawyer, like as a prosecutor, what I took away from that was that as a prosecutor, you never want to have a lawyer on the jury, because the lawyer is oriented to taking the idea of innocent until proven guilty really seriously, and the other jurors were much more on the idea of, does the weight of the evidence show that she was guilty? And it did. But as I said, that wasn't the standard. The standard was guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, and they couldn't quite wrap their minds around that and didn't want to. Now the question though is that there was definitely a vigorous debate on that jury because of me. So if I had not been a holdout, she would have been convicted in 10 minutes. Instead, we went for a number of hours and we really had it out. I wasn't convinced, they weren't convinced. But actually, there's a reasonable case to be made there that was a very legitimate conversation. And she should have been held guilty at the end of it, because 11 out of 12 people voted for her guilt. And there was a vigorous conversation. That's not how the American system works. The American system instead essentially gave me veto power over her conviction. And in a way, I got a twofer, right? Because I got a vigorous conversation and I was still able to prevent her from being found guilty. When I was done with the whole thing, I actually had, one of those moments like you describe on Yochanan ben Zakkai's deathbed. I mean, I had a lot of sense of guilt. Maybe I didn't do the right thing. Maybe I let somebody off who's gonna, the other jurors were saying drunk driving is a really bad offense. And I was like, yes, I agree, it's a bad offense. That's why I don't want to convict somebody who may not have been guilty. And there was all kinds of reason to suspect that there was some wrongdoing on the part of the police. But at the end of the day, maybe 11 out of 12. So maybe it should have gone the other way. So it's interesting to see, like, just take a particular case that I experienced, and say, actually, maybe this would have worked better.
It's really interesting, because the way the Jewish legal system works, that person would have been convicted.
Right.
And
but the fact that if it was just that unanimity, if unanimity is allowed to convict, then you could get the 10-minute, she's guilty, right? And that I definitely agree shouldn't be allowed.
Right.
You shouldn't be allowed to just everybody sit down, go around, everybody agrees she's guilty, conviction. And that is how the American system does allow that. And so I like the idea that no, not only, right, we have to make sure that the real conversation happens. I love the idea of the overnight, it has to go overnight. Whatever the toolbox is, makes a lot of sense to me.
And what's interesting about the overnight requirement is that the overnight requirement is not only there for when they take the final vote to convict. Anytime there's new additional evidence, there has to be an overnight deliberation of that evidence. They can't come to any conclusions when there's new evidence without an overnight. It's interesting.
Yeah. Okay. Continue.
Okay. So having gotten that out, the text now goes into, and you have to always understand the editor as the Talmud is the product of the editor, and the message of the Talmud is the message of what the editor wants to put together, next to one another. The editor is putting together teachings from different people in different generations in order to create something that he wants to say. And now comes immediately after this, the debate over what are the requirements for someone to sit on a Sanhedrin that's going to be adjudicating capital cases. What kind of person do we need to determine life and death for somebody else? What do you need to be like to be able to make such a weighty decision best? And for me, this is code for what's this ultimate human being that our entire Jewish enterprise is out to create? What would that person be like? How would they think? What character traits and qualities would they have? Because that ultimate ideal-ish, I hate to say ideal, but I can't find a better word. What would that person do on a court? But by extension, what kind of world would we have if everyone were that kind of person? That's what we want ultimately. Every human being to be as close as possible to that ideal judge on a 23-person Sanhedrin. Okay, so now we have a debate, a dispute, in fact, between two rabbis. Okay, so the first rabbi is Rabbi Yochanan, and we'll go back to our text.
Okay, so Rabbi Yochanan says, they place on the Sanhedrin, this great Sanhedrin, only men of high stature and of wisdom and of pleasant appearance. Does high stature here mean height or like pedigree?
Well, it's unclear. Rashi tells us that actually it is exactly what it says. It's height.
Oh, okay.
It's tall people, just simply tall people. Okay, so
Okay.
Rabbi Yochanan starts out and he says there are 6 or 7, I forget at the moment, number of qualifications that anyone who sits on this Sanhedrin needs. The first one is they have to be just simply tall.
Okay, tall.
Okay, go ahead.
Wise.
Wise.
Good
okay.
looking.
Good looking. Okay, so once you put tall and good looking together, in Rashi, an 11th century commentator, puts those together, he probably has a text where they are next to each other in the text. He has a different manuscript maybe. And he essentially says it's the JFK effect. Okay, he doesn't use that term in the 11th century, but that's what he's talking about. He says tall and good looking, that's important because those things, for better or for worse, actually create a sense of sort of awe, and people will respect the judges if they're tall and good looking. Again, problematic, but he may be onto something.
Right, because by the way, it doesn't, I mean, the translation says men, but it doesn't specifically say men, but men is of course implied, and the language is in the male form.
It is.
So it's actually eight characteristics, right? They're men. And
yeah, very good.
Tall, so tall, good looking, wise,
Yeah.
Of age, a certain age.
Of a certain age. Okay, we get that. I like that.
Okay, now also,
right, reflects a certain life experience.
Right. Maybe,
okay.
It's interesting because like you say, Rashi has this manuscript where tall and good looking is together, and I imagine that wise and of age then are more together, and those kind of pair well. I mean, when you look, a certain sense of how they look and a certain sense of kind of what's inside them in terms of wisdom. By the way, it reminds me about Rabban Gamliel's criteria for who can study in Yavne, right?
Right.
It was people whose inside are like their outside.
Right.
This idea of attention to both appearance and inside. What was
right? I like that.
Okay, so they have those, and they also must be masters of sorcery, and they must know 70 languages. So
okay,
that Sanhedrin doesn't have to hear from a translator.
Okay, so let's do the sorcery. And the sorcery one is fascinating. So sorcery is something that the rabbis understand to be a real thing. It's not like hocus pocus. It's for real, and it's prohibited. In other words, it's something they believe in, and they believe that we shouldn't be participating in. But to sit on the Sanhedrin, you have to be a master of it. I just find it fascinating. You have to be a master of something that's actually a prohibited practice.
Right.
And Rashi here clarifies that the reason the judges have to be masters of this prohibited practice is so that they can recognize when a defendant or a witness is using sorcery, this prohibited practice of very real magic, to pull the wool over the eyes of the judges, to somehow cast a spell over them to make them think the defendant is innocent or guilty when not, and to sway and influence towards something that isn't true the judges. And just a sidebar on this, the Rashi goes on to say, Rashi gives an example of someone who is a master of sorcery, who uses sorcery to sway people from the true path. And this line in Rashi where he gives an example of such a person has been self-censored by rabbis and Jewish leaders so that non-Jews don't see what we're saying and, punish us. And the self-censored Rashi here says an example of someone who uses, or people who use sorcery to sway people from the truth is like the Egyptians. Oh, the story of Moses throwing down the staff and it turns into a snake, and then Pharaoh does the same thing. And but that magic wasn't from God. It was illusory magic. That is actually the censored text. And put your seatbelt on for this. The actual text says, for example, Jesus the Christian. And it reveals the fact that the rabbis felt that Jesus was someone who utilized magic to sway or influence people, Jews, away from Judaism.
And how do we know that? Do we have the original text?
We do. In fact, the Steinsaltz version of the Talmud in his original Hebrew, Aramaic Hebrew translation brings down that original, for example, Jesus the Christian. And most translations, in fact, the one I have in front of me says, for example, the Egyptians. I have a Telman. Yeah.
One thing, though, that I want to point out as I'm looking at the Aramaic is that the word is the word before each characteristic is ba'ale, ba'al, and it's the same for all of them. So it's ba'al koma, masters of height, ba'ale chokhmah, masters of wisdom, ba'ale mar'eh, masters of looks, and ba'alei zikna, masters of, or owners of age, and ba'alei kshafim, owners of sorcery. Like what that means to me is like the translation. I feel like Steinsaltz's translation here, I think is apologetic and wrong, in the sense that what he says is that they have to be people who basically know about sorcery. In order to sort of be able to be watchful for it, as opposed to people who themselves do sorcery, which I don't see how you can translate it as anything other than people who do sorcery. Because all the other, it's not saying, because it's the same word, and so it's not like saying people that are, when it says ba'alei koma, like owners of or masters of height, it's not saying people who know about tallness, it's saying people who are tall. So that same word, it's not any different. So over and over again, it seems to be like these are the characteristics of the person, and you could argue that maybe it means the not owners of the knowledge about sorcery, but that would be a very stretched translation. A much more straightforward translation is they have to be sorcerers.
That's really interesting. I never thought about that. And that brings to mind one of my friends, colleagues, students, teachers, Maggie Anton, who's the author of the Rashi's Daughters series, knows a lot about sorcery. It plays into her novels. And I think she has told me something about the fact that the rabbis, in fact, did practice. I think you're onto something. I don't know enough about it, but I think there is something there.
Well, I think we're going to have a conversation at some point soon with Professor Shai Sekunda, who writes about the Persian, the Sasanian, that's the Persian sort of empire where this was taking place. I mean, it was technically in what we call Iraq today, but it was under the Persian hegemony. And I think that there was some kind of what I think they thought of as sorcery that was part of Persian culture. So it would be interesting to know more about that. I wonder.
Okay, great. Let's put a sticky on that.
Yeah. One other thing, just by the way, that I'm noticing as I'm looking at the Aramaic, the Hebrew, is that this is a bit of a subtle point. It's a little hard to, but if you look at it, you see it that when it says that they know what's translated as they know 70 languages,
Yeah.
the letter, the letter, the Hebrew letter that stands for the number 70 is ayin, which and the word that means languages is lashon.
Mm-hmm.
And the first three letters there, bet, ayin, lamed, is that same Baal, that
Whoa.
master of words. So one possibility, right, is that it's like a scribal error of some kind, and it actually was trying to say like Baale shown or something like that. I'm not sure Baale, maybe like it's actually an ayin. I don't know how to actually think of that exactly, but it's remarkable that the same word that was repeated over and over again, Baale, 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 is there again. It's just divided into two words that is then translated as they spoke 70 languages. So that, and if it's not a typo, if it's actually the way that it was initially written, which sort of makes sense because the next part is that an explanation of why they should know 70 languages so that they don't have to hear from a translator.
Right.
It's just interesting, sort of on a poetic level, that it's done. I mean, there's something going on there that I think is not an accident.
That's so interesting. I never noticed that. You're bringing to mind something that my friend and colleague Natan Margalit told me about years ago, and he wrote his PhD dissertation on the rhetorical devices in the Talmud that were particularly in the Mishnah, but also in Gemara, that were meant to facilitate memorization, and sort of the chiastic structures and the repetition of vocabulary elements. And I'll bet maybe there's something there. That's really interesting. Never noticed it. But in support of this theory that you have, this explanation for why the 70 languages suddenly turns to Aramaic, whereas the previous part is all in Hebrew. So that supports that explanation of why the 70 languages as a possible addition that steers the ayin lamed, the bet ayin lamed, into this understanding when it's really interesting. Okay, let's put a sticky there.
The one thing that I'll say, like, if it is intentional, the other thing that it reminds me of is the way that particularly Richard Elliott Friedman talks about how the Bible, well, it certainly was based on oral traditions. The Bible should be understood to be a written document that was composed as a piece of written work. And some of his evidence for that is some of the wordplay in the Bible that is only able to be seen when you read it. You don't actually hear it orally. So a great example of that is that in the story of Joseph and his coat of many colors, it turns out that the verb of yasaf, which means to add, but it's the verb of Yosef, the root of Yosef, Joseph, and it's repeated over and over again in different verb forms. But ultimately, the coat of many colors, which is a kutonet pasim, if you read pasim backwards, it basically is Joseph, mem, and then yud samech fe, so it's actually a play on the word Joseph, but it's only written backwards and you can't actually hear it, you can only see it. And so that's evidence that this is initially composed as a written document. So
wow, that's so interesting.
So there's something here that's like leaping off the page when I look at it in the original, which, by the way, is another reason why, as you're always an advocate for, if you can, checking the original.
Actually, I'm an advocate for only learning in the original.
Right.
but we'll put a sticky on that as well. Okay. So, but in any case, the traditional quote unquote understanding of this qualification is that the judges later, they'll go into, is it every one of the 23 or some number on the 23? But regardless, this qualification is knowing all of the languages. So all 70 languages, meaning every language there is, so that the judges don't have to hear testimony either from the defendant or witnesses through an interpreter. And I find that a fascinating insight. They understand that a translated testimony is going to lose something essential.
Mm.
And what I love about that is the realization that it's only in our own lifetimes that our American legal system has required the providing of an interpreter, even
Mm-hmm.
that to a defendant or a witness, that someone who speaks a language that the judge doesn't understand has to be provided with an interpreter. And this is saying, no, an interpreter will never be enough. The judge has to be a native speaker of the defendant or witness's language to really fully understand.
Mm.
I think it's a beautiful thing. Okay, so that's Rabbi Yochanan's position. That's the picture of the human being that he thinks ought to be deciding life and death. Someone who is tall, beautiful, wise, of a certain age, master of whatever that means, sorcery, and knowing the language of the defendant or witnesses. Okay, fine.
Wait, can I ask you one question? I know this isn't the direction that you want it to go, I think, but like one thing that jumps out at me about this description is that it fits no one, and
Yeah.
therefore nobody could sit on such a court. Therefore, there can't be such a court. Is that it, or you? I think you take it in a different direction, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. It gets deconstructed, on the very next page by saying, no, not everyone needs to be that. You just have to be sure there's representation on the court. And it's not so much, they narrow these things. But I find the narrowing and the specificity less compelling than the position that's going to come next, which is saying, no, Rabbi Yochanan, none of what you're saying is material. So let's not even go into how old exactly and, how many languages and how many people on the court need. No, none of that matters. There's only one thing that matters. So now we'll jump back into the text, and I see we only have 3 minutes. So
it's up to you. We can go a little long, or we can.
Okay. All right. Let's try to get this out in this episode.
Yeah.
Okay. So Rav Yehuda comes back and he says, my teacher Rav, who is a contemporary of Rav Kahana, actually, but regardless, Rav says, no. Those qualifications, Rabbi Yehuda, are absolutely unimportant, immaterial. There's only one qualification: that anyone sitting on a court deciding life or death, remember, read ideal human being here. Only one qualification they need to have. What do they need to have? They need, I'm not working, I'll go ahead and work from the translation. So the translation says they need to know how to render a carcass of a creeping animal pure by Torah law. Okay, so let me jump off of the English translation into the original. The original says they have to know how to take one of the 8 creatures which the Torah says by definition are impure, and prove that actually they are pure. Okay, so the Torah says that there are these 8 creepy crawly creatures. Each one is called a sheretz. And these 8 creepy crawly creatures are by definition impure, particularly or specifically when they die. The carcass of these 8 animals are by definition, says God, impure, meaning they have this existential state of what's called impurity, death embodiment.
It's different from a really bad thing
it's a really bad thing. It's a really bad thing. And it's immutable. It's something which can't go away. It's not like you can dump them in a mikvah or kasher them or do something and make them impure. They are existentially impure. That is who they are by definition. And what Rav is saying is the only qualification that's important to sit in the Sanhedrin is that you be able to find a way to prove that what God says is impure is actually pure.
Mm.
In other words, that you have to be able to turn the Torah over and be able to say that what God himself says is this way is not this way. For me, this is the most direct statement of the Talmud, that our relationship to our inherited tradition is one in which we can never take anything that is determined as to be fixed and immutable and eternal and say, well, our hands are tied. That's what it says. It says so right here. All right. There's nothing we can do about it. That should never be our relationship to our inherited tradition or the values in our society, or you name it. We have to be so sharp as to understand where this truth is hurting people, who is suffering, and then say this thing which looks like it's just part of the way the world is and what God says has to be, and we have to make it otherwise. It's a very radical statement, and it is an orientation to the world, to truth, to God in Torah, which is, it is the definition of radical. And I think we now have to go back and read this into that case of the defendant whom every one of the 23 judges looked at and said is impure.
Right.
And see, there's a relationship between these texts.
Well, if a court is made up of 23 people who are capable of taking the word of God, the direct word of God, on one of the most important matters that the Torah is concerned about, and that actually, having been studying a lot of Talmud lately, that the rabbis are concerned about, this idea of impurity, and is able to render it pure. And they can't figure out how to render this guilty person not guilty, right? Not a single one of the 23 can figure that out. Then ostensibly that's a less important case than God's word about one of the most important matters in the Torah. And so something is wrong, right? Because we know these people are capable of it and they're not doing it. And that might, then the question is like, well, what's wrong? It suggests that it's coming from a place of bias or a place of not wanting to find this person, a way for this person to be given some degree of mercy.
Right, or are in relationship to their legal system in an unquestioning, powerless, and passive way. They are not seeing themselves as responsible for actually overturning a system that's causing harm, for recognizing that's what's going on.
But I think what I really want to put a finger on, though, is it's not saying that the person who's guilty should be not guilty. It's saying that if you have 23 people and not one makes the argument, not one has kind of crossed into that place where we know that they could all find the person not guilty, because they all by definition can overturn the word of God, and that not one has gotten to the place where they have a different point of view. That means that basically they didn't try, right? And not one of them tried. And if not one of them tried, then that would suggest that there's some force that they are all responding to, the victims of. I don't mean that in a poor them way. I mean that they are flowing with these flows of society and the way that society treats certain people, and they are so much in it that they don't even know that they're in it. Like, something is so badly broken just by the fact that we know, and by the way, I think it's important that we say this idea that they have to be able to make the creepy thing impure or pure, because if you say, well, it's like 23 idiots, yeah, of course they couldn't find an argument, no. So the point is that, no, it's 23 of the greatest minds that we have, and nevertheless, not even one bothered to try to find a way for this person to be not guilty, we know something is deeply wrong.
Yeah. And I think another thing that I want to be sure comes across is anytime the rabbis in the Talmud are talking about a sheretz, one of these by definition creepy crawlies, or the issue of impurity at all, it's code. This is what I believe. It's code for what's our relationship to absolute immutable truth, or the assumption that there is any absolute and immutable truth. Because if there's any in the Torah, it's the issue of purity and impurity, and the sheretz as an example of that. And what I think Rav is saying here is, if you can purify or find a way to declare pure that which God himself declares impure, which is the most immutable of all things in the Torah world, certainly you can overturn some other part of the Torah or your inherited tradition when you notice that it's causing suffering, when you know that it's wrong, when you know that it can't possibly be our best guess at truth. And for me as a queer person who was at the receiving end of, Leviticus 18:22 and people pointing to the verse saying, man shall not lie with a man, it's an abomination. You're an abomination. You can't be queer and Jewish. Who you are is somehow against God. And oh, by the way, I'm really sorry. My hands are tied. I would love to change this, but I can't because it's just says so right there. This flies in the face of that relationship to and feigned
B'nai, we lost your audio.
I thought that might happen. Am I back?
They put it back on the thing. Yeah, I hear you now. So did you unplug it?
I did.
Maybe try doing it again, because it'd be great to have what you're saying in the same audio.
Okay. Am I back?
But I think you're from the other mic, so I think you have to change your mic input.
Am I back now?
Yes. Maybe put the mic back up there.
Yes, how's that?
I think it's good.
Yeah. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
But
Where did I go
I
silent?
I mean, you were saying, like, as somebody that the Leviticus says, and then there's the people that are pointing, and this tells them that this is.
Yeah, it's a very powerful statement that feigned impotence or claim that there's nothing we can do. This is the truth of our system, and whatever harm it might be doing, it's not for us to fix. This is the way it is. It just makes it obvious that never was the way the rabbis wanted us to relate to God, to Torah, or the way we should be walking through the world. And if not only you can, but you must be able to say that which is impure is pure, which is the most unchangeable thing in the Torah. Certainly you can say, you know what, this other part of the Torah that's hurting people, that can't be right either.
Right. If I am predicting correctly the text that we're going to do next week, we can continue this conversation, right? With the Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Meir and all that. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I think this is like there are things that I think there are connections that I'm seeing with what we're saying to the text that we've been studying up till now. For example, Rabbi Eliezer and pointing, at the voice of God, right? When we talked about how that's like pointing at the book today and saying, but this is how it has to be. There's nothing I can do. And this very much is in line with that. And I'd love to talk about all that. So I think that next week we're going to do another text that's along similar lines, and we're going to be able to continue this conversation into maybe some of those more today matters of today type of questions, and really looking forward to that.
Me too.
All right. See you next week.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.